A single feather, a cryptic message, and a murder hours later. Welcome to Echo Mysteriosa. I am your host, Ravela. Let me know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below. Your thoughts always make this mystery space feel alive. Let's begin. It was on one of those bleak, grey afternoons in early November when the fog had settled over London like a damp woolen shroud, and the gas lamps flared dimly against the creeping dusk, that I found myself once again seated in our lodgings at 221B Baker Street, opposite my remarkable friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The warmth of the fire had not yet banished the chill from my hands, and Holmes was in one of his more laconic moods, violin idle, pipe resting cold beside the Persian slipper, and his eyes half-lidded as though listening to music only he could hear. I'd been leafing idly through a medical journal when the knock came at the door. 2 firm raps, a pause, then a single, sharp one. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a man whose very entrance seemed to carry the bite of the street with him. He was bundled in a fur-collared greatcoat, though the collar was damp from fog, and a bowler hat glistened with dew. His mustache, grizzled and thin, matched his prematurely silvering temples. But it was not his dress that drew our attention. It was the thing he held delicately in his gloved hand, a single white feather. "Mr. Holmes," he began, eyes darting briefly to me, "I am Colonel Archibald Thwaite, formerly of the 22nd Light Dragoons. I have come to you on a matter I do not wish to bring to Scotland Yard. At least, not yet." Holmes sat upright, interest sparking in those piercing grey eyes. "Then pray sit, Colonel, and tell me what brings you and that rather curious specimen through my door." Thwaite lowered himself onto the settee and held out the feather. "This was found stuck to the inside of my daughter's bedroom window this morning. It is not the feather itself that has me rattled, but what is written on it." He passed it to Holmes, who took it with the reverence of a man handed an ancient manuscript. Holding it to the lamplight, he turned it this way and that, his brow knitting slightly. There, faint but unmistakable, scrawled in a cramped, slanted hand along the quill's spine, were the words, "Turn back now, or you'll see her blood run before Sunday." For a moment, there was only the soft ticking of the mantelpiece clock. Holmes spoke softly. "May I assume your daughter is in some form of danger, Colonel?" "She is already, I fear, in a sort of entrapment," Thwaite said grimly. "Her engagement to Lord Charles Merrow has been a cause of quiet concern for my wife and me, though we did not wish to interfere. But this," he gestured to the feather, "has changed the matter entirely. She received a similar warning last month on a piece of lavender paper, folded into her book of poetry. It, too, referenced blood." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Tell me more about Lord Charles." "He is heir to the Merrow estate in Surrey, a man of means, lineage, and influence, but I have never liked the look in his eyes. He is too smooth, too courteous. There is a history of mental illness in that family, if you believe the gossip. I have my suspicions, Mr. Holmes, but I lack the evidence. Scotland Yard would treat it as a prank, but I fear it is something far darker. I presume your daughter is unaware of this morning's warning?" Thwaite hesitated. "No, she saw it. She screamed. I had our manservant comb the grounds, but found nothing, not even footprints in the wet earth. It was as though someone had simply vanished into the fog." Holmes's lips quirked upward, ever so slightly. "A feather written upon, delivered without trace, with words that suggest urgency, blood, and a time frame. A theatrical gesture, and one meant to frighten rather than to inform." "Curious." I interjected, "But how would one even write on a feather?" "With a fine-tipped steel nib," Holmes replied, "and considerable patience. The question is why. A man who wishes to frighten a woman could do so more simply. A note through the post, a scrawl on a mirror. This," he twirled the feather in his fingers, "is deliberate. Symbolic, even." "Then you believe this is no common hoax?" asked Thwaite. Holmes rose and paced to the window, drawing the curtain back to peer out into the thick, soupy fog of Baker Street. "Colonel, I believe you have come just in time. Today is Thursday. If the warning is to be trusted, your daughter's life may be forfeit in 3 days." He turned from the window with that sharp glint in his eye I had come to know well. It was the look of a man already chasing the thread through the labyrinth. "I shall require the following: the original lavender note, access to your daughter's chambers, and, if possible, a private audience with Lord Charles Merrow." Thwaite rose at once. "I can have a carriage brought round within the hour." Holmes nodded. "Excellent. Dr. Watson and I shall accompany you. There is something unnaturally precise about this matter, and I should like to examine the window." As the colonel made ready to depart, Holmes turned once more to the feather. He laid it gently upon a blank sheet of paper, studying it with a jeweler's eye. "Watson," he murmured as the colonel stepped into the hall, "do you observe the spine of the feather?" I leaned in. "Aside from the writing, no." "Precisely. But note the indentation on the barbs here. Very faint, but unmistakable. This feather was pressed between glass and wood. A window closed upon it. But there's more." He plucked up his magnifier and traced a near-invisible smear near the quill's base. "Watson," he said, "do you detect that faint red-brown tinge?" I peered closer. "It appears to be dried blood." Holmes smiled grimly. "Then this is no prank. Let us go to Kensington. The air smells of secrets." And with that, we descended into the thick London fog, toward a house with high windows, an anxious daughter, and a feather that whispered of murder. The fog clung to our coats like wet gauze as we stepped down into the street, where Colonel Thwaite's carriage awaited. Holmes climbed in with the same quiet urgency that marked his manner whenever he smelled a riddle that had not yet turned its face. I followed, and we rode in silence for several minutes, the only sound the clip of hooves and the faint hiss of wheels on damp cobblestones. Holmes, his chin pressed to his chest, seemed to vanish into thought, and I knew better than to interrupt. It was not until we crossed into the broad avenues of Kensington that he stirred. "Colonel," he said, lifting his gaze without moving his head, "has your daughter recently quarreled with anyone? A maid dismissed, a suitor spurned, a friend estranged?" "Not to my knowledge," Thwaite replied, his brow furrowed. "She is not the type to inspire enmity. Mildred is quiet, well-read, and far too gentle for dramatic gestures." Holmes made a small noise of skepticism. "Gentleness does not render one immune from obsession, Colonel. Often it attracts it." We arrived at Thwaite's residence, a tall, respectable brick house set back behind a black wrought-iron fence. The windows glowed faintly through the mist. A manservant opened the door at once and bowed us in. Within, the house was tastefully appointed, polished wood, dark velvet drapes, and the faint scent of lavender lingering in the hall. Holmes paused, only to remove his gloves before requesting to see the daughter's chamber. Thwaite led us up the curved staircase, his hand grazing the banister with the familiarity of a man who has climbed it in haste and worry. Miss Mildred Thwaite's bedroom was at the end of the hall, a quiet corner room overlooking the garden. Holmes crossed the threshold and stood still for a long moment, his eyes sweeping the room with deliberate calculation. It was a simple and elegant space. White lace curtains, a writing desk with an open volume of Keats, and a chaise by the window where the glass pane still bore a faint smudge in the shape of a feather's curve. Holmes approached the window and crouched. "This is where it was found." Thwaite nodded. "Stuck here, along the bottom edge of the inner pane." Holmes examined the window frame, running his fingers along the edge, then removing a small steel tool from his coat and prying gently at the sill. A speck of red lifted under his blade. He sniffed it, then scraped it into a glass vial. "Blood," he said, "partially dried. Left not more than 12 hours ago." I moved to join him, noting that the latch had been freshly scratched. There was no forced entry, Thwaite said behind me. The window was locked from the inside when we found it. Holmes nodded absently. Locked, yes, but not impenetrable. The sash has been tampered with. See here, Watson. The inner lock bears signs of having been manipulated by wire or pick. A practiced hand, but not a perfect one. The feather was meant to be discovered from inside, which tells us the sender had no interest in remaining unseen, only untraceable. He stood and turned to the writing desk. With gloved fingers, he opened the top drawer and examined its contents. Paper, a fountain pen, dried ink, a few folded letters, and a velvet ribbon still scented faintly with perfume. Colonel, you mentioned a previous warning. May I see it? Thwaite produced it from a folded envelope in his breast pocket. Holmes accepted it delicately. The lavender sheet bore a brief message in the same hand, though shakier, as though written in haste. He is not what he seems. The blood will be yours if you do not leave him. Holmes held the note beside the feather, comparing the script. Same hand, he murmured. Same ink. A woman's hand, perhaps, but trained. And yet... He stopped suddenly and bent closer, examining the edges of the lavender paper. Cut with a blade, not torn, and quite precisely. A commercial stationery, Watson, cheap, manufactured in batches. I have seen this particular hue only once before, in a tobacconist's shop on Fleet Street, where it is sold as letter paper for novellas and private correspondence. Thwaite exhaled audibly. What does it mean? It means, Holmes said, straightening, that the writer is someone within your daughter's social reach, someone who had access to this room or was confident enough to approach it from outside. There was a gentle knock at the door, and a woman entered, tall, slender, dressed in mourning grey, with a pale, intelligent face framed by dark curls. Papa, she said softly. Is something wrong? Holmes turned with interest. Miss Thwaite, I presume? Forgive the intrusion. I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We are here on behalf of your father, concerning the warning you received. Her composure faltered slightly, but she did not shrink. I see. I thought he might do something like this. Holmes gave her a long look. Miss Thwaite, may I ask, has Lord Charles ever mentioned enemies? Rivalries? Jealousy among former companions? She gave a delicate shrug. None that I can name, though I would not say he is without conflict. He is intense and proud. I've met no one quite like him. Holmes studied her, not unkindly. Have you met his family? His uncle, yes. Sir Theodore Merrow. They live together now. Lord Charles has been estranged from his mother since childhood. And this uncle, what is your impression? A pause. Kind, generous, perhaps too doting. Holmes turned slightly to me. Watson, I shall want you to visit the tobacconists on Fleet Street. Purchase a sample of the lavender paper and inquire as to who bought any recently. Mention only that you're assisting a literary society in tracing an author. Be discreet. I nodded, already halfway to the door. Colonel, Holmes said, turning back to Thwaite, your household staff, how many have access to this floor? Only the maid, Clara, and our housekeeper, Mrs. Breddon. Both have been with us for years. Nonetheless, I would like to speak with them, separately. Thwaite departed at once, and within minutes the maid was ushered in, a red-cheeked girl of no more than 19, clearly nervous. Holmes questioned her gently, drawing out small inconsistencies. She had polished the window the day before. She had not noticed anything strange, but she had heard something in the garden the night before. Footsteps on gravel, she thought. She dared not look. Do you know Lord Charles? Holmes asked suddenly. She hesitated. I've seen him. Once. He came at night last week. Miss Mildred met him at the door and walked with him in the garden. Miss Thwaite blushed slightly. I asked Clara to say nothing. My father does not approve of visits after sunset. Holmes's expression sharpened for an instant, then softened. "Thank you, Clara. That will be all." When she had gone, Holmes turned to the Colonel. "I must meet Lord Charles tonight, not formally. I should like to observe him without being observed." Thwaite bristled. "And what if he sees through your disguise?" "Then he shall see nothing at all. I may pass for a footman, a vagrant, or a tradesman as needed." He paused at the window again, touching the faint smudge left behind. "Doctor," he said as I returned with a small packet of lavender paper and news that 2 reams had been sold in the past week, "do not trouble to change. We leave at once. There is more to this feather than sentiment or theatrics. Someone has chosen their symbols with care. Blood, a bird's token, and a message that arrives with neither sound nor trace." He looked out across the fog again, the twilight deepening around his face. "They are warning her," he said softly, "but not from kindness, from calculation. The writer wishes her fear, and fear is only useful when it is just enough to keep you still." And with that, he turned from the window, coat already buttoned, eyes aflame with purpose. The evening deepened as Holmes and I made our way from the Thwaite residence, the fog thickening like curdled milk over the cobblestones. The gas lights were smudged halos in the mist, and our footsteps made no more sound than the ticking of a gentleman's watch. Holmes had changed his appearance with a swiftness that still astonished me. In place of the tall, clean-shaven figure in tailored wool stood a slightly hunched, grey-bearded fellow in a tradesman's patched coat and cravat, twisted just enough to appear untended. A smear of ash across one cheek completed the illusion. "Watson," he murmured as we turned onto a quieter side street, "you shall keep a distance of 40 yards and approach the house once I have gone round the side. Observe only. Say nothing. You believe Lord Charles will appear? He already has, I suspect, or will soon. There is something to be gained from fear, but only if one remains close enough to watch it manifest." Kensington's houses loomed around us like silent sentinels. Number 18, Sir Theodore Merrow's home, stood on a quiet square, its windows darkened save for the faintest glow behind the second-story drapes. Holmes slipped around the iron fence and vanished into the garden shadows. I waited across the street, pretending to examine my pocket watch, the brim of my hat tilted low. Moments passed. Then I saw movement behind the upstairs curtain. A figure, tall, angular, stood momentarily against the light. It turned and paced, pausing once more as though addressing someone out of view. Just then, a flicker of motion caught my eye on the ground floor. Holmes had approached the side door and rapped once, briskly. It opened. A butler, or someone dressed as one, let him in. The door closed. 10 minutes passed. I moved to a better vantage point, pretending to check the laces of my boot beside a lamp-post. Inside, the silhouette continued its pacing. Once I thought I saw a second figure, shorter, seated, but the curtain swayed just enough to obscure the form. Then Holmes emerged again, no longer stooped. He walked briskly across the street toward me, discarding the fake beard into a drain as he passed. "He was there," he said in a low voice. "Lord Charles himself, and someone else. His uncle, most likely. But it is the maid who interests me more." "You spoke with her?" "Briefly. Long enough to confirm that a letter was sent from this house 5 days ago to Miss Thwaite. A sealed envelope containing a single page." "The feather note?" "No," Holmes replied. "Something else." She did not see the contents, but she recalled the envelope. Cream-colored, with a Merrow crest pressed faintly on the flap. We walked swiftly through the fog, the edge in Holmes's gait unmistakable. "I saw Lord Charles only from a distance," he went on. "He is pale, angular, with a neck that cranes forward unnaturally, as though his body leans into secrets. His speech is careful, his tone slow. A man who weighs his words not for elegance, but for effect. Yet it was not he who intrigued me most." He stopped beneath a flickering lamp and looked toward the darkness. There was a scent in that room. Jasmine, laced with something metallic. Blood, perhaps, or rust. And beside the fireplace stood an oddity, a birdcage, empty but freshly cleaned. I raised an eyebrow. A bird? Possibly. But there was no seed, no food dish, just a single white feather fallen beneath it. My blood chilled. You think the feather left at Miss Thwaite's window came from that cage? I think it likely. Which raises a new question. Who wrote on it? We returned to Baker Street well past 10 o'clock. Holmes set the vial of dried blood beside his microscope, then carefully unfurled the lavender note again. He muttered as he worked, making notations in his small ledger. 2 types of handwriting, he said finally, straightening. The feather and the lavender note were written by the same hand. Slanted, leftward tilt, pressure uneven. Yet the ink on the feather is more deliberate, slower, as though written with caution. A woman's hand still, but not without intelligence. I watched him from the chair by the fire. You suspect someone within the Merrow household. I suspect someone who moves freely between both households. Someone who wishes to warn Miss Thwaite, but not enough to prevent harm, only enough to stop the marriage. A jilted admirer. Holmes shook his head. Too simple and too emotional. No, Watson, this is not driven by jealousy. It is driven by calculation. He stood abruptly and rang for Mrs. Hudson. Have this delivered by messenger to Colonel Thwaite, he instructed her, handing over a small note. He is to keep Miss Thwaite under constant company, never alone, and he is not to speak of tonight's visit to anyone, including his daughter, particularly his daughter. When she had gone, Holmes poured a measure of brandy into his glass and stood by the window. Watson, consider the image we have thus far. A warning delivered with blood, written on a feather, a message tucked into a book of poetry. A suitor of ambiguous manner, raised by a man of means, who keeps an empty cage and sends unmarked notes. And a young woman, Miss Thwaite, who receives these messages and says nothing to the man she is to marry. You think she suspects something? I think she knows more than she dares admit. Whether out of fear or guilt, I have yet to determine. He sipped the brandy, then added softly, and there is one more thing. I looked up. The feather was clipped at the quill, a straight, blunt edge, as though it had been removed with a knife. No natural mold. That means it was cut deliberately. Indeed, as one would prepare a pen or a weapon. I felt a chill creep along my spine. Holmes turned back to the fire, the shadows dancing along his sharp features. Tomorrow, Watson, we go to the Merrow estate in Surrey. We must see the grounds, the house, and, if fortune permits, Sir Theodore himself. The answer lies in that cage, and in what it once held. And if it held nothing, then we have only the absence of a bird, Holmes said softly. And in this case, Watson, that absence may be louder than any song. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, the faintest smile tracing his lips. The fog pressed against the window panes like a question still unasked, and I knew that the heart of the mystery had not yet shown itself. But Holmes had caught the scent, and soon the blood behind the warning would lead us to the one who sent it. We departed for Surrey early the next morning, while a thin winter sun hovered pale above the rooftops of London. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent during the journey. He sat with his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half-lidded, not in slumber but in thought, gathering threads, tugging gently at the fabric of the case to see where it might fray. I did not interrupt him. The countryside rolled past, frost still clinging to the hedgerows until the tracks curved eastward and a station platform emerged from the haze. A carriage awaited us, sent by Sir Theodore Merrow himself, though the letter had been arranged by Holmes through a fabricated recommendation from a certain Inspector Hillgrove of the Metropolitan. Sir Theodore had replied graciously, inviting us to lunch and a tour of the estate, unaware that the true nature of our visit was far from social. As we rode through the Merrow grounds, the air grew stiller. The estate was expansive, set into a copse of ancient oaks and flanked by gardens now dormant in winter sleep. The house itself was a wide Georgian manor with ivy curling up its eastern wing and chimneys that breathed faint plumes into the air. It was neither ostentatious nor austere, but there was a kind of alertness to its quiet, like a creature pretending to slumber. A butler received us at the door, tall and liver-spotted, and led us through a series of hallways into a drawing-room whose fireplace crackled politely. Sir Theodore Merrow greeted us there. He was a large man with thinning hair and an almost florid affability, his smile broad, his handshake firm, and his manner that of a man well accustomed to being liked. "My dear Mr. Holmes, it is a pleasure. I've heard your name more times in drawing-rooms than some members of Parliament." Holmes returned the smile with one of his own, thin, precise. "And yet I am merely a private citizen with a curious ear, Sir Theodore." "Modesty is a trait I never trusted." The older man chuckled. "You've arrived just in time. Charles is out walking the grounds, but will return shortly. Do join me for a glass of Madeira before lunch." We did, and I observed Sir Theodore carefully. He was charming in the way of men who have rarely needed to lift more than a finger to get their way. His affection for Lord Charles seemed genuine, but I noted how his gaze flickered just slightly whenever Holmes mentioned Miss Thwaite. "I understand your nephew has become quite fond of Miss Mildred," Holmes said lightly. Sir Theodore nodded. "Indeed, I must confess it came as something of a surprise. Charles has always been distant, solitary, you might say. But she's softened him. I've seen it." "She must be quite persuasive," Holmes murmured. "And you approve of the match?" Sir Theodore hesitated, just a moment too long. "I do, though I might have preferred he wait a bit longer. There are matters, family obligations, inheritance complications, that still require settling." "Matters concerning his mother's side, perhaps?" Holmes asked, sipping. The older man's gaze sharpened briefly before softening again. "Quite right. There were disputes after her passing. Nothing Charles need be troubled with." Just then, the butler entered to announce Lord Charles's return. Moments later, the man himself stepped into the room. He was precisely as Holmes had described, tall, narrow-shouldered, and pale, with dark hair brushed meticulously back from his forehead. His expression was smooth, his smile faint, and his movements elegant in a way that seemed too rehearsed. His eyes were the only part of him that did not comply with the performance. They moved too much, always measuring, always watching. "Mr. Holmes," he said with a small bow. "Doctor, I understand you are guests of my uncle. I hope you find the estate agreeable." "Very much so," Holmes replied evenly. "Your gardens are admirable." "Charles tends them himself," Sir Theodore added proudly. "He's quite fond of the hawthorn grove in the western paddock." Holmes inclined his head. "I should very much like to see that. But first, perhaps, you would permit me a glance at the eastern wing." "The old nursery?" Lord Charles' smile faltered just slightly. "It's unused. We've kept it closed since my mother passed." "Dust and old lace." "Precisely the kind of place I find instructive," Holmes said. "If it's not too much trouble." There was a pause. Then Lord Charles gestured smoothly. "Of course. This way." He led us down a long corridor, the air cooling noticeably with each step. The carpets here were older, the portraits heavier, and the walls bore a stillness that felt cultivated. At the end of the hallway was a tall door with a brass handle dulled by age. Lord Charles opened it. The room within was dim, the curtains drawn. Dust clung to the corners, and old furniture stood draped in linen sheets like ghosts at rest. Holmes stepped inside at once, his eyes flicking from corner to corner. Against one wall stood a covered cage, large and made of wrought iron, its bars shaped into arches like the ribs of a cathedral. Holmes moved to it and gently lifted the cloth. Inside lay a perch, an empty water bowl, and a scattering of small white feathers. "A bird once lived here," Holmes said. "A dove, perhaps." Lord Charles folded his arms. "A gift from my mother. It died years ago. I've never replaced it." Holmes reached in and lifted one of the feathers. It was white, unblemished, and curved slightly near the tip. This cage was cleaned recently. Charles didn't blink. "I don't like dust." Holmes smiled faintly and set the feather down. He crossed to the window and examined the frame, noting something with his fingertips. Then he turned. "And this window, does it still open?" Charles shook his head. "Painted shut. Has been for years." Holmes nodded, satisfied. A curious choice for a room so long unused. He glanced around once more, then gestured toward the door. "I thank you. Now, if we might visit your greenhouse. I've a fondness for orchids." Charles led the way. Holmes lingered a moment to cast one final look at the cage, then followed. It was not until we had returned to the train, Surrey behind us and the dusk thickening, that Holmes spoke again. "The cage was cleaned 4 days ago," he said. "The feather in it matches the one delivered to Miss Thwaite, and the window had been sealed until it was forced open and repainted within the last week." "Then the cage held more than a memory," I said. "Indeed. It held a messenger, a dove, trained, I suspect, by Lord Charles himself. Used not to carry letters, but to deliver fear." I frowned. "A trained dove? But why use such a strange method?" "Because it leaves no trail," Holmes said. "No footprints in the soil, no tampered postmark. Just a message, cryptic and ominous, found in an unreachable place." He leaned back, eyes glowing. "And yet something is still amiss. Lord Charles is clever, but he's not careful enough. He did not expect anyone to inspect that room. And Sir Theodore, did you note his hesitation? He fears something, not for himself, but for what Charles might do. Do you believe Miss Thwaite is truly in danger?" Holmes turned to the window. The countryside sped past like a breath held too long. "Yes, Watson," he said quietly. "I believe she's in grave danger, and I believe she knows it." When we returned to Baker Street that evening, the lamps in the sitting room burned low and steady, casting long shadows against the bookshelves and the drawn curtains. Holmes threw off his coat and went at once to his desk, where he extracted the vial of dried blood scraped from Miss Thwaite's window frame. He said nothing as he worked, examining it under his lens, adjusting the illumination with the patience of a man setting the final tile in a mosaic. I sat watching him in silence, the memory of that cold nursery still vivid in my mind. The way Charles Merrow had stood too still, too smooth, and the glint Holmes had caught on the window latch before hiding it behind a comment about orchids. The cage, too, gnawed at me. It had not merely been emptied, it had been prepared, wiped of history, but not thoroughly enough. Holmes finally broke the silence. "Human blood," he said quietly, "but not Miss Thwaite's. Not unless she has been concealing an injury, and I doubt that very much. There's an element of performative cruelty to this, Watson. The feather was meant to alarm, yes, but it was also meant to prove something, to show that the threat was close, intimate." I rose to pour myself a measure of brandy. "Close, but still cloaked in riddle." Holmes tapped the vial once against the desk, "which means we must speak with her again, privately this time. There is something she has not said, whether out of fear, guilt, or loyalty, I cannot yet tell." He was already at the door before I could finish my glass, and within the hour we were once again inside the drawing-room of the Thwaite household, welcomed not by the Colonel this time, but by Miss Thwaite herself. She wore a pale blue house gown, her hair pinned back loosely, and there was a stiffness to her posture that had not been present before, as though each word she was about to say had to be passed through a gate of deliberation. "My father is out for the evening," she said as we were shown in. "He left for his club shortly after receiving your note." Holmes inclined his head. That is for the best, Miss Thwaite. I hoped we might speak plainly. She gestured for us to sit, but did not take a chair herself. Instead, she crossed to the fireplace and stood with one hand resting on the mantel. Her eyes flicked once toward the staircase behind her, then fixed on Holmes. "You've been to see Charles," she said softly. "Yes. And his uncle." "Then you must have guessed something of the truth." Holmes did not answer immediately. He let the silence stretch until it pressed on her, drawing something from her posture, her fingers tightening just slightly, her shoulders curving inward. When he spoke, it was gentle, but precise. "You've received more than 2 warnings, haven't you, Miss Thwaite?" She hesitated, then, with a slow exhale, nodded. 4. The first arrived in August, pinned beneath my bedroom door with a hairpin. "Do you have it?" "I burned it," she whispered. It frightened me. Not just what it said, but how it knew where I kept my diary. It referenced things I had never spoken aloud. Holmes folded his hands. "And yet you continued your engagement." I had no proof, only fear. And Charles, he can be kind when he chooses to be. At first, I thought perhaps someone wished to frighten me away from him for spite or jealousy. But after the second warning, I began to believe it might be the opposite, that someone wanted me to remain with him. Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Explain." The language changed. The first note warned me to leave him. The second said that if I left, others would suffer. By the third, the threat was not to me at all, but to my father. It said, "Turn your back and he'll bleed for your disloyalty." I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. "And you said nothing of this to him?" Holmes asked. I tried, but Charles listens only when he chooses to, and when he does not, he looks at you with such calm, with such certainty, that you begin to wonder whether your fears are simply shadows in your own mind. Holmes stood slowly. "Miss Thwaite, has Lord Charles ever raised his hand to you?" "Number never." "Has he ever spoken of your mother?" That caught her off guard. Her breath hitched. "Number, why would he?" "Because you mentioned your diary and the note that referenced it. A private book, I imagine, full of things a young woman might reflect on alone. Memories, feelings, perhaps even a name. Your mother's name." Her lips parted, but no sound came. Holmes pressed gently. "What was her name?" "Elena," she said at last, as though the syllables themselves were fragile. "Elena Ward. She died when I was 12. Holmes closed his eyes for a moment, then looked at her again. "And have you ever mentioned her to Charles?" She shook her head. "Never." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, do you recall the framed photograph on Charles Merrow's mantel, the one half hidden behind the clock?" I did. A black and white portrait of a young woman with dark hair and pale eyes, seated in a high-backed chair, her hand resting delicately on the arm. "Elena Ward," Holmes said quietly. "Or as she was known before her marriage, Elena Merrow." Miss Thwaite sat down suddenly, her face drained of all color. "My mother, Charles's half-sister," Holmes confirmed. "They share a father, but not a childhood. That nursery we visited today was not merely closed for sentiment, it was sealed like a tomb. Elena's childhood was not as gentle as your own." Sir Theodore raised Charles under the guise of civility, but with a hand that kept secrets behind polished doors. I stepped forward. "But why threaten Miss Thwaite? Why not simply reveal the connection?" Holmes met my gaze. "Because knowledge gives you power, but secrecy gives you control. Lord Charles is not merely guarding a family scandal. He is punishing someone, either Miss Thwaite or himself. And he's doing it by creating a world where fear becomes obedience." Miss Thwaite's voice was barely audible. "Then I was never to marry him." Holmes shook his head. "Number, you were never meant to leave." He turned toward the window, where the night pressed against the glass like a watchful eye. "There will be another message, Watson. Perhaps tonight. The pattern is too deliberate, and this time we shall be waiting for it." She looked up. "You mean to trap him?" "No," Holmes said. "I mean to expose him, to himself most of all." And as the fire flickered and Miss Thwaite's gaze returned to the staircase, I saw the first tremor of truth begin to take hold, like a shadow drawing breath in the silence before revelation. The following morning brought with it a bruised sky and an uneasy stillness that clung to Baker Street like a residue. Holmes, having spent the better part of the night in his armchair, eyes closed but mind evidently active, roused himself at first light and dispatched 2 telegrams. One to Inspector Gregson, requesting discreet background checks on Elena Merrow and her siblings, and another, more cryptic, to a private contact in the Foreign Office. He refused to tell me what it contained. By 9 o'clock, a messenger arrived from Colonel Thwaite. The man brought neither letter nor message, only a parcel, plainly wrapped in brown paper, bearing no return mark. Holmes opened it slowly, and inside lay a single object. A white feather, not inked, but dipped in something darker, viscous and red. Blood. Fresh. For several moments, Holmes said nothing. Then he reached for a clean sheet of paper, laid the feather upon it, and leaned in to examine the shaft under his magnifier. His face, though impassive, betrayed a flicker of something beneath the surface, urgency, perhaps, or fury honed into silence. "It was left at the front door," he murmured. "No signature, no sign of delivery. The colonel will have already searched the perimeter, and he will have found nothing." I took a step closer. "So the game is in motion." Holmes gave a curt nod. "This is not merely a warning. It's a mark of possession. Whoever left this is telling us they can come and go as they please, that no bolt nor door can stop them." He retrieved the previous vial of dried blood from the desk and held it beside the feather. "Different viscosity. This is fresher, and it's not human." I frowned. "Not human?" "Bird's blood, Watson. From the same dove whose feathers we've now seen 3 times. He's killed it to send a message." He turned and fixed me with a look that was suddenly sharp. "We must go to the Thwaite residence at once. Mildred is no longer merely the object of control. She is the fulcrum." By the time we reached Kensington, a light rain had begun to fall, misting the windows and softening the outlines of chimneys and lamplight. The house appeared still from the outside, but a subtle detail caught Holmes's attention immediately. The lace curtain in Mildred's bedroom window had been drawn aside by an inch, just enough to permit a view of the street. A signal. Colonel Thwaite opened the door himself, pale and grave. "I received it this morning," he said. "I didn't wake her." Holmes moved past him with purpose. "We must speak with her now, and no one else. Not the servants, not the housekeeper. Lock the side doors. Have your man wait by the rear entrance." We ascended the stairs swiftly, and when we entered Mildred's room, we found her already dressed, standing by her writing desk, her posture rigid with anticipation. "I saw him," she said before either of us could speak. "Last night, in the garden." Holmes approached slowly. "Charles?" She nodded. "I woke near midnight. I had not slept deeply. There was something, I don't know, an instinct. I looked out and saw him standing by the hedge. He did not move. He only looked up, toward my window, and then he raised his hand, as if in greeting." Holmes's gaze flicked to the desk. "Was anything left?" She hesitated, then opened the top drawer and withdrew a folded page. Cream stock, slightly damp, bearing a faint imprint of the Merrow family crest on the corner. Holmes unfolded it. The message was brief. "You opened the cage. Now watch what flies in." Beneath it, the faint trace of red where the paper had brushed the blooded feather. Holmes said nothing for several heartbeats. Then he turned the paper over and studied the watermark. Same origin as the previous note. Cut with the same blade. But the message is different in tone. Less a threat than a statement. He believes she's betrayed him. He looked up. Because of us. Mildred flinched slightly. Then he knows you're involved. Oh, he knows far more than that, Holmes said. He's testing the boundaries, seeing how far he can go before we try to stop him. This is the final stage. He no longer needs to maintain appearances. I stepped forward. Holmes, we must act. This has moved beyond manipulation. He's delusional. No, Watson, Holmes said coldly. He is lucid. Terrifyingly so. He's constructing a moral theater in which Mildred must play the role he has written for her. The warnings, the feathers, the cage, each was a scene, and now the climax approaches. He turned to the colonel, who had just entered behind us. You will remove your daughter from this house by nightfall. You will take her to your club or a secure location where she can be observed at all times. Inform no one, not even the servants, and do not return here until I tell you it is safe. The colonel looked from Holmes to his daughter, then gave a stiff nod and departed to make preparations. Holmes stood at the window and watched the thinning rain. He will come again. Tonight or tomorrow. He must. His ritual demands it. What shall we do? I asked. Holmes turned, his expression carved from stone. We shall let him think he's succeeded. We spent the remainder of the day preparing the house. Holmes had me place a decoy figure in Mildred's bed, an old trunk beneath the coverlet, padded with towels, her shawl arranged at the head. A candle burned low beside it. We doused all lamps save one in the hallway, allowing just enough glow to suggest life remained within. Holmes, meanwhile, arranged bell wire along the eastern fence and concealed it behind the hedge, rigged to a simple pressure switch affixed to the back gate's latch. By midnight, the house had gone silent. I waited with Holmes in the colonel's study, overlooking the garden from a narrow slit between the drapes. The fog had returned, though thinner now, like a veil. We watched. For nearly 2 hours, there was nothing. Then, just after the clock struck 2, a movement in the trees beyond the hedge, a shape long and thin, slipping between the trunks. A figure emerged in the garden. Holmes stiffened beside me. It was Lord Charles. He approached slowly, head slightly tilted, as though listening to something only he could hear. He wore no hat, no overcoat, only a dark suit that shimmered faintly in the dew. He crossed the lawn and reached the flower bed beneath Mildred's window. There, he knelt and retrieved something from beneath the sill. Another feather. But this one bore no writing. It was soaked through, a mere sodden curl of white. He gazed up at the window. Then, very softly, he raised both hands and pressed them to the glass. Holmes moved. We burst from the room, down the hall and through the door, the signal already sprung. A sharp metallic snap rang out behind the hedge. The bell wire had tripped. Charles turned just as we reached the garden. For a moment, his eyes met Holmes's, and in that instant, all composure drained from his face. He bolted, but he had not seen the second wire Holmes had rigged. His foot caught it mid-sprint, and he fell, hard, striking the earth with a thud. By the time we reached him, he had curled into himself, clutching something in his hand. It was the feather. And as Holmes pried it from his fingers, Lord Charles whispered, not to us, but to the darkness behind us. She was never meant to leave the cage. And then, in the hush that followed, the rain began again. Not loud, not fast, but slow and soft, as if the night itself had been waiting to exhale. We did not speak as we escorted Lord Charles back into the house. His steps were sluggish, but deliberate. No longer a man fleeing, nor even resisting, but one who had resigned himself to a moment he had rehearsed long before. Holmes said nothing as he led him into the drawing room and gestured for him to sit. I could see that Charles's eyes had lost their sharpness. They seemed turned inward now, not dull with madness, but dazed, caught in the memory of something he had long kept submerged. Holmes remained standing. The silence held for a long while before he finally broke it. Not with accusation, but with the soft weight of certainty. "The warnings were not meant to frighten her away from you," he said. "They were meant to draw her closer." Charles's hands, still smeared faintly with earth from the garden, opened slightly on his knees. "You knew she wouldn't tell anyone," Holmes continued. "You knew her nature. Gentle, loyal, the perfect audience for your theater." "She was never supposed to leave," Charles murmured, not lifting his gaze. "It was supposed to keep her here." "The cage," Holmes said quietly. Charles nodded once. "The bird was my mother's. When I was a child, I would listen to it sing. It was the only sound in the house that didn't feel like a performance." "And when the bird stopped singing?" Holmes asked. Charles blinked slowly. "It died. My uncle said it was a shame, but he never fed it properly. My mother cried. He told her to stop being weak." Holmes stepped closer. "And when your mother died?" Charles looked up. His eyes were no longer calculating. They were emptied of guile, and something in them reminded me, fleetingly, of Mildred's, though darker, worn by years of rehearsal and absence. "He locked the nursery, told me to forget, but I couldn't. I remembered everything, the smell of her perfume, her voice, even the way she looked at me when he entered the room." Holmes's voice sharpened. "He harmed her?" Charles did not answer. He looked instead toward the window, where the garden was beginning to mist again with the early stirrings of dawn. "I never knew I had a sister," he said. "Not until last year. My mother wrote letters to her child from her first marriage. Mildred. They were hidden in the lining of her old writing box. My uncle never knew I found them." He laced his fingers together, the knuckles pale. "When I read them, I saw it. Everything she'd hoped for. All her softness, all the care she gave away, but never received in return. And I realized she had another life, a better one, and I was locked in the cage of the worse." "And so you wrote to Mildred?" Holmes said. "Not as myself," Charles murmured. "At first I only meant to observe. I watched her from afar. She reminded me of my mother, the way she moved, the things she read. I thought, if I warned her, I could protect her, from men like my uncle, from becoming someone's prisoner." "But the warnings changed," Holmes said. "They became contradictory. Threats layered with concern. You were no longer protecting her. You were trying to keep her afraid." Charles looked down. "Because she began to drift. When she told me she had doubts, I panicked. I told her she was safe, that we were perfect, but I saw it in her eyes. She didn't believe me. She was starting to step out of the story." Holmes knelt, his voice lower now. "And you couldn't allow that. You'd written the role too well." "I thought," Charles whispered, "if I gave her something to fear, she would stay. Not out of love, but necessity, and if she stayed long enough, perhaps it would become love." A silence followed that confession, the kind that doesn't ask to be filled. Then Holmes rose and addressed me without turning. "Watson, wake the constable. Have him sent for." I paused. "You mean to have him arrested?" "For harassment, for unlawful entry, and for endangering Miss Thwaite's safety through calculated psychological manipulation." Charles gave no protest. Holmes looked at him one final time. "The dove died because you tried to turn memory into a cage, but she was never yours to keep." We left him seated there in the chair as the light of morning filtered into the room. Outside, the constable had arrived by 5:30, and Charles was taken away without incident. No resistance, no final words. Later that morning, Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, where a letter awaited him. He opened it in silence, scanned it, then handed it to me. It was from Sir Theodore Merrow. Brief. Cold. He wrote that Charles would be disinherited immediately, that he would take no responsibility for the boy's emotional aberrations, and asked, in curt prose, that Holmes refrained from publishing the details of the family's affairs in any sensational form. Holmes read the note once more, then calmly placed it in the fire. "History," he said, "has already written its indictment." We received news that same afternoon that Miss Thwaite had taken a temporary residence with her father in a small manor house outside Bath. The Colonel's letter was short but sincere, expressing gratitude without flourish. Mildred had asked not to correspond directly, for now, but had enclosed a pressed violet between the pages. Holmes looked at it for a long time before placing it gently inside the pages of his commonplace book. That evening he smoked by the fire, legs stretched, violin silent beside him. I watched him in the fading light, his expression unreadable. "You pitied him," I said quietly. Holmes did not look up. Number Y understood him, but that is not the same. And as the final embers hissed low, I wondered if, in some quiet corner of his mind, Holmes was still standing by that cage, watching the door open, not to let something out, but to let something in. A week passed. The air in London had turned cold and brittle, and the fog that once hovered low now stretched higher, as if withdrawing from something it had seen too clearly. Holmes had returned to his usual rhythm, intermittent violin bowing, monastic reading, and occasional bursts of nervous energy that led him from armchair to bookshelf and back again. But I could tell the case of Lord Charles Merrow lingered in the folds of his mind, not as a puzzle unresolved, but as a wound unclosed. I found him one morning staring out the window, a cup of untouched tea on the sill beside him. The city stirred below, omnibuses clattering, the bakery's chimney already puffing. He was not watching the street. His gaze was inward. I crossed the room and stood beside him. "You've received another letter, haven't you?" He nodded once, then handed it to me without a word. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet elegant, restrained. "Mr. Holmes, you may not remember me by name, but I was once the maid in Sir Theodore Merrow's house. I was dismissed quietly last week, though no formal reason was given. I was told not to speak to anyone about Lord Charles, and certainly not to you. But there is something I must share. Not for justice, which I no longer believe in, but so the truth does not die entirely locked away in rooms with sealed curtains and polished floors. There was no bird in that cage. There never was." Respectfully, E.M. Holmes took the letter back from me and laid it flat against the arm of the chair. "It confirms what I already feared," he said. "The feather came from another source. Perhaps purchased, perhaps plucked from a pillow, but it was never from a dove that sang." I sat slowly. "You mean the cage was part of the illusion?" Holmes nodded. "Everything he constructed, the blood, the notes, the warnings, was theatre, but not merely for Miss Thwaite, for himself. And yet," I hesitated, "there was a second presence in that house. You noted it yourself. Someone seated in the drawing room, someone who never showed their face." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Yes, Sir Theodore claimed to be alone that evening when we visited. But I saw a shadow, and I heard movement that did not match his stride." He rose suddenly and retrieved his notebook from the mantel. "When Charles was taken, his uncle responded with mechanical coldness. That is not unusual among men of his station, but there was a precise distancing in his words. He absolved himself entirely, and yet still wrote to me directly, as if safeguarding something. You believe Sir Theodore knows more. I believe he buried more, and not in the garden." Within the hour, we were bound for Surrey once more. The sun had not risen high enough to warm the mist from the trees, and the branches hung low with condensation. The Merrow estate stood as before, imposing, self-contained. But the curtains were drawn tight now, and the windows above the eastern wing bore signs of recent cleaning, as if someone had wiped away a history. The butler who greeted us had changed. A younger man, less assured, who hesitated before letting us in. Sir Theodore received us in the study. His expression was serene, but it lacked the warmth he had previously summoned with such ease. This time, there was only calculation. "I had assumed our business was concluded, Mr. Holmes," he said, gesturing without enthusiasm toward a pair of armchairs. "What remains?" Holmes did not sit. "I've come to ask a question, Sir Theodore. One you might prefer not to answer." Sir Theodore lifted an eyebrow. "Then I imagine I shall decline." Holmes stepped forward. "There was no bird in that cage, never. Which raises the question, what purpose did it serve in that house?" Sir Theodore looked away, then chuckled softly. "A curious thing to fixate on, don't you think?" "No," Holmes said. "It is the very axis on which the entire structure of this manipulation turned. Charles constructed a world with that cage at its center, but its emptiness wasn't his invention. It was inherited." Sir Theodore's fingers drummed once on the edge of the chair. "My sister," he said quietly, "was not well. Elena, I'm sure you've gathered as much." Holmes said nothing. She believed her first child had been taken from her. She wept for that girl long after the courts had awarded custody to the father. She would sit in that nursery for hours, whispering stories to an empty crib. I placed the cage there to focus her grief, to give it form, something she could project onto. I felt Holmes still beside me. "The dove never existed," Sir Theodore said. "Not for her, not for Charles. It was a phantom, a mercy." Holmes's voice, when it came, was like glass just before the crack. "And you never told him?" Sir Theodore met his gaze. He was a boy. What would it have helped? Holmes's jaw tightened. "Everything." A silence unfurled between the three of us, thick and absolute. Then Holmes turned to leave. "You've locked away every door that might have given him light. Don't be surprised that he learned only to walk through shadow." We returned to Baker Street by dusk. Holmes said little on the journey, and even less that evening, but he did retrieve the pressed violet from his commonplace book and hold it for a long time before placing it carefully in a small envelope, addressed but not sealed. The next morning, a carriage arrived bearing Inspector Gregson. He brought a report, concise, grave. Lord Charles had taken his own life. It was done with precision. A blade, the vein in the neck, the silence of a man who had written no note, left no signs, but had folded one final object in his hand, a single, clean feather. Holmes read the report, then rose and walked to the hearth. He stared at the flames for a long while, then said, "He died as he lived, writing the ending before anyone else could." He tossed the inspector's envelope into the fire and stood in silence until the last ember had faded into ash. And though the case was over and the culprit no longer breathing, I understood then what Holmes already knew. Some stories do not close with a door or a cell or a courtroom. Some stories close only when someone finally says, "This was not love. This was not care. This was control, dressed as devotion." And somewhere in Surrey, a cage sat empty still, but it no longer mattered what had lived there, only that nothing ever would again. The days that followed passed in quiet increments. The city carried on, oblivious to the thin thread of tragedy that had wound its way through Kensington and curled around the lives of those who would speak of it only in guarded tones, if they spoke of it at all. Holmes returned to his cases, though I could tell he approached each with a different gravity now, as though something in him had been recalibrated not by the puzzle itself, but by the human cost hidden beneath its resolution. He had said little since the news of Lord Charles's death. Not from indifference, nor the emotional detachment so often ascribed to him, but from a weariness that stemmed, I think, from seeing too clearly. Holmes could bear the weight of deceit, of crime, even of madness. But when cruelty masqueraded as love, when a person's need twisted inward until it became possession, he turned more silent than usual. Not because he could not understand it, but because he did. On the third day after the report, a small envelope arrived, bearing a familiar hand. Holmes opened it carefully and handed it to me without comment. Mildred Thwaite had written, "Dr. Watson, I hope you will not think it improper that I write to you instead of Mr. Holmes. I cannot yet bring myself to speak with him, though I remain deeply grateful for what he did, for what you both did. My father has taken me to the coast. It is quiet here. The sea comes in with a slow rhythm, like someone trying to remember how to breathe again. I find myself watching it for long hours, wondering how much of what I thought I understood was ever real. Charles. I do not know what to say. I think part of me believed I could fix whatever was wrong in him if I stayed, if I was gentle enough, careful enough. But I see now that I was not the audience for his warnings. I was the stage. Please tell Mr. Holmes I do not hate him. I know he did what was necessary, but if he ever walks near the edge of sorrow, as I have, I hope he remembers that it is not a place one chooses to reach. It is a place one is led to, sometimes gently, sometimes with a feather. Yours sincerely, Mildred Thwaite Holmes read the letter again after I passed it back. He folded it slowly and placed it in the drawer beside his tobacco. He did not speak for several minutes. Then he stood, retrieved his coat, and without a word, left the flat. I did not follow. I knew where he was going. He returned some hours later, chilled and silent, his coat damp at the hem. He did not remove it, only crossed to the fireplace and stood there, unmoving. Then he spoke, and it was not to me, but as though to the room itself, or to something within him that had gone unanswered. There is a point, Watson, where the desire to protect becomes indistinguishable from the desire to control. Charles crossed that point long before he ever set pen to feather. But what haunts me is not his dissent. It is how carefully he disguised it as care. I said nothing. Holmes's voice had softened, more introspective than I had ever heard it. He stared into the flames. He believed he was saving her, from what he never defined. Loneliness, perhaps, the inevitability of change. But his method was always the same. Fear, finely measured and delivered in increments. He built a world where love meant obedience, and obedience meant safety. I finally stepped forward. But Mildred saw through it. He turned to me slowly. Not at first, and that is the danger. The tragedy, Watson, is not that Charles was lost to madness. It's that he was lucid enough to build a convincing map of it for someone else to live inside. We stood in silence, the fire crackling faintly. Then Holmes moved to his desk and withdrew a small parcel wrapped in plain brown paper. He opened it carefully and revealed what lay inside. The last feather, the one found clutched in Charles's hand. It was smaller than I remembered. Not clean, not sharp-edged like the others. Its barbs were frayed, its tip bent, the quill cracked near the root. He set it down gently on the blotter. "No ink this time," he murmured. "No message, no theatre, just the symbol, unadorned." "A confession?" I asked, "or a resignation, perhaps both." He left it there on the desk, untouched, and for days it remained, a quiet reminder that some stories do not close with answers, only acknowledgments. A week later, I visited the Thwaites. The house in Kensington stood quieter than before. The servants moved with a softer step, and Colonel Thwaite, though polite, wore the look of a man who had seen his assumptions collapse inward. He thanked me without elaboration and handed me a folded sheet Mildred had written before leaving again for the coast. "Tell Mr. Holmes I remember the night the final warning came. Not for the words nor the blood, but for the quiet that followed when I finally opened the window and realized there was no one there. I waited for the sound of a dove. I waited for a sign that I'd misunderstood everything. But there was only stillness. and in that stillness, I finally heard myself again. When I returned to Baker Street and read it aloud, Holmes nodded once. Then he closed his eyes and whispered, "And that, Watson, is what Charles feared most." What? That she might learn to live without him. It was raining that night, a soft, continuous rain that turned the streetlights to halos and wrapped the city in its own memory. Holmes sat long by the window, violin across his lap, unmoving. And I realized then that, for all his brilliance, for all the logic and deduction that made him feared and revered in equal measure, it was not solving crimes that marked the measure of Sherlock Holmes. It was recognizing when the truth came not as a revelation, but as a reckoning. And for once, there was no applause, no triumph, only the feather. Frayed, bent, laid to rest on a desk that would never again read its message aloud. The final chapter of the case came not with a confession, nor an arrest, nor even a final deduction delivered before a room of witnesses. It came with silence. It came with the absence of a sound that had haunted us from the beginning, the imagined flutter of wings that never were. Spring was beginning to whisper along the edges of London when the last ripple of the affair reached Baker Street. A small, rectangular envelope arrived, hand-delivered by a boy with a smudge of soot across his cheek. It bore no seal, no identifying marks, only my name, carefully penned. I opened it at the table while Holmes paced behind me in his dressing gown, the morning paper unread beside his teacup. Inside was a single card, pale cream. It read, "Doctor, Watson, you were kind when kindness felt far away." I wish I had found the words to say that sooner. There are no feathers here, no locks, no theatre, just a quiet garden where the air is honest. Tell Mr. Holmes that I am well. I'm beginning again, not as someone's idea of who I might become, but as myself. Entire. With sincere gratitude, Mildred, I read it twice, then passed it to Holmes. He took it in silence, then turned it over, inspecting the paper not as a detective, but as a man reading the ending of something he had not written, yet helped conclude. "She writes with clarity," he said finally. "She writes with peace," I added. Holmes folded the card slowly and set it atop his correspondence stack, though he did not file it away. He left it there in plain sight, as if to remind himself that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only survived. The days that followed resumed their rhythm. The city turned its face toward the sun again. Carriages passed along Baker Street with less haste, and the scent of damp soil and new blossoms replaced the chill memory of fog. Holmes and I took on a case involving a stolen ledger from the docks. Mechanical, straightforward, the kind of problem that required no emotion, only observation. He was efficient, brilliant, irritable at times, but more present than I had seen him in weeks. One afternoon, while sorting through old files, Holmes paused over a name, Merrow. He stared at it for a long time, then slipped the folder into the fire without a word. I didn't ask. I only watched the paper blacken and curl, the ink vanishing last. Later that evening, I found him standing by the mantel, violin in hand, though he did not play it. He was looking at the empty armchair across from mine. The feather, the last one, had disappeared from the desk days ago. I hadn't asked after it. I assumed he'd destroyed it. "Watson," he said quietly, "do you know what I find most sobering?" I looked up. That I never solved him. Charles. Holmes nodded. I traced his actions. I understood his intent. I unraveled the threads of his fear, his grief, his control. But I never solved him. Because to solve a man is to reach the core of his truth, and I believe in the end, Charles was hollow. I thought of that. Of a man constructing elaborate threats not to injure, but to tether. A man using shadows as shelter, who built a story so convincing that even he couldn't find the edges anymore. He wanted to be filled, I said. Holmes nodded, but he feared what would happen if he let someone else hold the key. So he disguised the lock as devotion. There was no triumph in his tone, no satisfaction, only acceptance, tempered with something gentler. We spoke little more that night. Holmes eventually played, soft, unhurried notes that drifted upward and lingered long after the strings fell silent. I sat with my notebook open, though I did not write. For once, there was no need. The story was finished. Not wrapped neatly, not perfectly understood, but concluded. Sometimes that must be enough. A fortnight later, while walking along the embankment, we passed a woman seated alone on a bench beneath a blooming chestnut tree. Her back was straight, her hands folded in her lap. She wore no black, no veil, only a pale blue dress and a small violet pinned to the collar. Holmes did not pause as we passed, but I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. She looked up, met his gaze for only a moment, and gave the smallest nod. Not a greeting, not a farewell, just a moment of shared memory, an acknowledgement that they had both lived through the same theater and exited through different doors. He tipped his hat without breaking stride. When we turned the corner and left her behind, Holmes said, "That was not coincidence." "No," I agreed, "but it was choice." That evening, I recorded the final notes of the case in my journal. I did not title it. I did not assign it a date. I left a space where a heading might have gone and simply wrote, "There are some crimes that leave no marks on the body, but build cages in the mind. There are some victims who survive not because they are rescued, but because they choose to unlock the door themselves. And sometimes the feather is not a warning. It is what remains after the bird has flown." When I closed the journal, Holmes looked up from his reading. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The fire crackled between us, and somewhere far beyond the city's edge, the wind carried no message, only silence and peace. The late afternoon sun cast long golden blades across the parquet of Baker Street's sitting room when the knock came, a firm, deliberate tap that echoed faintly between the walls. Mrs. Hudson appeared at once with a letter on a silver tray. Holmes received it without rising. He slit the envelope with the tip of his pocket knife and unfolded the paper within, his eyes scanning the lines with an expression so still it might have been carved. He passed it to me without comment. "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson, you will be pleased to know that Miss Mildred Thwaite has been formally released from all familial obligations regarding the Merrow estate. In light of recent events and private testimony submitted by Sir Theodore himself, her name is to be kept wholly separate from the matter of Lord Charles Merrow and the legacy he abandoned. She is, by all accounts, well. This letter is sent on behalf of her solicitor, but the enclosed line was penned by her hand alone. Tell Mr. Holmes he was not wrong, but tell him I'm not broken. Yours respectfully, R. Hartley, Esquire." I looked up from the page, my voice quiet. She has reclaimed her name. Holmes inclined his head once, and her story. It was a quiet conclusion, without dramatics. No courtroom declaration, no last-minute confession, but the structure had held true. Every clue had served its purpose. The inked feather, the blood-stained window, the shadowed nursery, the empty cage. They had all pointed not to a villain to be handcuffed, but to a sickness, one born of grief and control, of delusion passed down like heirloom silver. The feather was not a riddle to be solved, but a pattern to be interrupted. "I've often said, Watson," Holmes murmured, rising at last and stretching his long frame toward the window, "that the mind rebels against vagueness. It craves form, sequence, logic. But what we encountered here was logic bent inward, used not to reveal truth, but to mask it." He paused as he watched the street below, the familiar ebb and flow of carriages, pedestrians, dogs, and steam. "And yet," he added, "there was still a crime." Control, I said. Indeed. Quiet. Beautifully wrapped, but absolute. He needed to be the author of her every reaction. And in the end, he was the architect of his own undoing. Holmes nodded. Because he forgot the one truth even the finest web cannot escape. People change, and sometimes they leave. The fire had dimmed to embers by the time Holmes sat again. He reached across to his violin and drew the bow across the strings. Slow, soft notes that wandered but never settled. A minor key. Neither mournful nor sweet. Simply real. I closed my notebook on the final page. Not every case ends in justice. Not every villain is caught. But this one ended in freedom. And perhaps that, in the final calculation, is justice enough. Outside, the wind shifted, and somewhere in the city's sprawl, a woman who had once been afraid was breathing freely. The case of Sherlock Holmes and the warning scribbled on a feather was closed, but its memory lingered, fragile, precise, and weightless, like the feather itself, 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 the feather itself.